I'm ready to start the motor's disassembly process, and I already have my photography ready so that I can tape the screws on the photograph from which they came. And all I'm going to do, what I'm going to do first, even before I remove this clamp, the field clamp, is I'm going to remove 3 screws on each side of the motor. This one holds this worm gear cover on. Once you get that screw out, and it is a hard screw, it's a harder metal that goes into a softer metal, so you be careful with it, is you'll be able to lift this off with probably some tweezers. Then I'm going to disengage and remove these 2 screws here and here. All those will do is to take the bearing strap off. Now the bearing for the armature is underneath that, and all this does is hold that bearing in place so that the armature stays in place. So you got 3 tiny parts, you got the bearing strap, and then you got 2 screws. I usually tape them to the photograph. I'm going to perform the same thing on this side, except it's going to get a little bit more complex over here. This one, like we said before, allows me to remove the cover that goes on the worm gear right here, this little black cover. And releasing these 2 screws will not only allow me to get to the bearing strap, which is underneath, you can barely see it sticking out there, but it'll also disengage the brush bracket assembly, which consists of this bracket that comes up in this shape, in this direction, across, down, and across again. It will allow you to disengage these 2 springs, which apply the pressure to the brush, and that's it. Then you can lift the brush bracket assembly off and you get your first view of the commutator. And the final release will be in taking these 2 screws out, which allows me to get to the field and to the armature. Now the armature is not going to have any wires connected to it, of course, but the field is, and this is where you need to handle this delicately. You don't want to fracture these wires or cause them to become disconnected from the field. We all know that story before, and they're not impossible to reconnect, but they're very, very tedious. So I want to protect the field and just set it down probably on the opposite side over here, and then I can pull the motor away and it's just freestanding after that. Once I get the brush bracket assembly off, I can pull the chassis, the armature, these 3 pieces. As a matter of fact, you can wait until you've separated them to remove these 3 screws. However, these 2 right here are going to hold this brush bracket assembly in place, and you'll not be able to slide the motor assembly towards you, the chassis and the motor assembly towards you, until you've released at least these 2 to get this brush bracket assembly off, which is attached to wires. What I elected to do to get the disassembly started was to disengage and back out the 2 screws on this end that not only hold the brush bracket assembly in place, which you can now see moving around, and the worm gear cover, or at least, excuse me, not the worm gear cover, but the bushing strap right there. So all I did was, to improve that working, is take my tweezers and disengage this brush spring right here. They just clamp on the far side of the brush holder, and you can push them in and then let them go, and the brush will no longer be under any pressure, and it is free to move about the commutator. As a matter of fact, now you're getting a good view of how black that commutator is, and I mean, it is solid black. If, as you know, it gets oil on it, it being the commutator, it will greatly degrade the performance, and you never know, this thing might need brushes. Next, I'm going to disengage these 2 screws and get this motor separated. I chose to remove the worm gear cover on each side and each bearing strap prior to being able to lift. That has to be done because I forgot, the field, of course, surrounds the armature, and you can't just take the field straight up without first freeing the armature, because you've got to lift the armature up and then slide it forward or backwards to get it out from around the field. Now, one of the things I did not notice is I did want to take this field clamp off prior to getting to this point, but I can't do it because either the person who was on the assembly line that day or AC Gilbert designed it this way to save an inch of wire, passed the wire through an opening right there in this field bracket and passed it on the other side, creating this bridge that goes across, which blocks this clamp from coming off. So I had to work around that to get this done. But these are nothing more than the 6 tiny screws that I showed you before, from here and then 2 positions up here, these 2 positions and that one, to lift the cover off and the bearing straps. Now the bearing straps are just these little copper straps. Here's one right here. It doesn't look very copper because it is so aged. And the other one is over here somewhere. Oh, right there. It's just hard to see. That's the other bearing strap. I will clean those up, of course. All the other screws in their relative position are on the tape to this photograph. Now, this is not a best practice or something you have to do, but I found it worked best for me to keep the parts inventory and to know where I am and to return screws to their original locations. It just worked best because I did find that some screws are a little bit different in their threading, even though they're all machined, hopefully from the same machine, and they should match the threads that are already in the softer metal. Now I did run into 2 problems. These end screws were bound in there so tight I could not get them out with one of my smaller screwdrivers. I had to go get one of my ratcheting screwdrivers, which has a long neck on it, but the ability to swap out for some very, very small, sharp, flathead blades that are wide and sharp in order to get the leverage on that to remove those. And I didn't want to damage them, of course. Now you can see how black that commutator is. Solid black. And there's just all kinds of carbon dust down in there. So the next step will be simply to remove pull up and remove the armature, freeing it up, and then sliding it to one end because it doesn't have any wires attached to it, freeing it. Now the brush bracket assembly is free, the chassis is free, and that leaves the field and the field clamp. Now I'll probably, because they're not really in any kind of moving mechanism, I'll just lightly clean them in place. I'll have to clean the brushes in place. And there's the tip of one of the brushes right there. I'll have to clean those in place because they're part of the brush bracket assembly. The 2 most difficult things to clean to me is always the armature and the commutator and the chassis. Look how black those gearboxes are from that old grease. Now the axles still turn, but as I mentioned to you before, I've actually removed these in the past, and the axles would not even rotate. They were so gummed up with old grease or rust. So we're ready now to probably do the least attractive part of this job, and that is washing all this, degreasing it with AutoZone brake cleaner, and returning them then to their original positions.